My name is Daniel Ortega, and for a little over 11 years I worked as a cemetery caretaker in northern New Mexico. When people hear that, they usually picture one of two things. Either they think I spent my days clipping grass around polished headstones in some quiet green place, with sprinklers ticking in the sun, or they think I'm the kind of man who went looking for ghosts and got what he wanted. Neither one is true. Most of cemetery work is dirt, paperwork, weather, and timing. It's keeping irrigation lines from freezing in January. It's filling sinkholes where old graves settle after a wet summer. It's checking plot maps against county records, because families arrive angry and grieving at the same time. And if you put a backhoe in the wrong place, no apology is big enough to fix it. It's replacing cracked vases, hauling dead flowers, leveling roads after monsoon washouts, and making sure the gate rollers don't jam when a funeral procession is stacked up outside. For the first 3 years, nothing happened to me that I couldn't explain. Then an old man I worked with disappeared in the south section during daylight. After that, I started keeping a notebook in my truck. At first, it was just for dates, names, and things I thought I'd need if anybody ever accused me of drinking on the job or losing my head. Later, it became a way of checking myself. If I wrote something down while it was fresh, I could read it a week later and see whether it still sounded real. It always did. I'm not telling these stories because I think it will settle anything. It won't. I'm telling them because people have a bad habit of treating places like that as symbolic. A cemetery is supposed to mean grief, memory, respect, closure, something clean, something final. The one I worked in wasn't final at all. It was a working place, and something in it did not like to stay buried. I started at San Isidro Memorial Park in Mora County when I was 32, after the hardware store in Las Vegas cut staff, and my mother's oxygen bills got bad enough that I needed a county job with benefits more than I needed pride. San Isidro sat outside town on a low rise of hard ground ringed with juniper, chamisa, and old barbed wire. There was a chapel made of pale stucco, a maintenance shed with a roll-up door that groaned in winter, 2 newer lawns with straight military rows, an older Catholic section with tilted stones and family plots behind short iron fences, and a south field that the county used for indigent burials and unclaimed remains. The old part of the cemetery had been there in some form since the 1880s, maybe earlier if you believe the parish records. The newer sections were measured and mapped. The south field was different. It had markers, but not always names, sometimes just dates, sometimes numbers. The records on those plots had been copied and recopied so many times you could hold 2 binders side by side and get different answers for the same stretch of ground. Most days started before sunrise. In summer, I'd unlock the gate around 5:30, so I could get the watering done before the heat made the hoses too hot to touch. The air out there at that hour had a clean, cold edge even in June. Dust would still be settled. The flags on veterans' graves would hang slack. Cottontails moved between stones like they owned the place. If there'd been rain in the night, the smell changed. Wet soil out there had a mineral smell first, then creosote and rotting pine blown down from the higher country. And under that, there was something older that came up strongest around the south field after a storm. Not rot exactly, more like cold mud turned over from deep underneath. By 7, the families started coming in. That surprises people too. They think cemeteries are empty except for funerals. They're not. Not in a small county where everybody knows where their people are. We had widowers who came 3 mornings a week with folding chairs. We had women who wiped dust off photographs with the corners of their sleeves. We had men who talked to stones in Spanish and Tewa and English, same tone they'd use fixing fence with a cousin. We had kids who ran ahead of their parents until somebody hissed at them to slow down and show respect. The dead stayed part of the neighborhood. That was normal. The first man I learned from was named Raul Varela. He was 68 when I met him, though he looked older in the hands and younger in the eyes. He had done everything the county could ask a man to do without paying him enough for it. Road crew, snow plow, landfill, maintenance. He ended up at San Isidro because, in his words, the dead complained less than the living, and never called his supervisor. Raul taught me the work the way practical men teach anything. No speeches, just corrections. Don't start the trimmer before checking for loose rosaries in the grass. Always walk a new grave after backfill. Your machine lies to you about level ground. Keep spare batteries in the cab, not the shed. If the shed lock freezes, nobody cares except you. If a family asks for 5 minutes, give them 15. If the ground sounds hollow where the map says it shouldn't, mark it and come back with the probe. He didn't drink coffee after noon, rolled his sleeves exactly twice, and carried an old Motorola radio clipped high on his chest even when it was off. He had a habit of stopping mid-sentence and listening, which I took at first for bad hearing. Later, I understood he was listening for things I hadn't learned to notice. There were county procedures for everything, and then there were the things Raul told me that weren't written anywhere. Don't whistle in the equipment shed after dark. If a funeral arrives before the hearse, make sure they stay in their cars until it does. If a dog starts digging in the south field, chase it off from the roadside, not from behind. I asked him once why. He said, because behind is where it wants you. That was the first answer he ever gave me that wasn't useful on its face. I laughed, because that's what you do when an older coworker says something that sounds like superstition, and you still want him to like you. Raul didn't laugh back. He looked out toward the south field, where the marker posts sat low and pale in the glare, and said, I'm not joking with you, Daniel. Some places get old in a way people don't. They stop keeping the same rules. That should have sounded dramatic. Coming from anybody else, it would have. From him, it sounded like weather advice. I let it go. The truth is, I stayed longer than I should have, because the job made sense to me. Grief makes people strange, but the work around grief is simple. A plot is measured. A grave is dug to code. Water runs or it doesn't. A headstone tilts or it doesn't. You can fix practical things. At home, my mother's lungs got worse whether I paid every bill on time or not. In the cemetery, my effort made a visible difference by the end of the day. Then, little by little, I started noticing things that didn't fit. Fresh footprints where the gates had still been locked. The sound of tapping from inside the tool cage when I knew I was alone. A plot number painted on a temporary stake 1 week and gone the next, with no burial recorded there. Families insisting flowers had been moved from one grave to another overnight, always from the newer sections to the south. And once, while checking the fence line after a storm, I found a child's white church shoe half buried in the mud near the wash, not weathered, not old, with the leather still soft. No report of a missing child, no funeral that matched it, just one shoe with clean straps, like it had been set down and pressed into the earth by a careful hand. I put it in lost and found in the office. 3 days later, it was back in the mud by the wash. That was still before anything I'd call a story. Those were just details. A place collects details. If you work anywhere long enough, you develop a private pile of things you can't quite explain, and don't need to. Old houses creak, freezers click, irrigation valves chatter. A cemetery on bad records and older ground is going to feel wrong from time to time. What changed was not the wrongness. What changed was that the wrongness began answering back. When people ask me when I first understood that San Isidro had a pattern to it, I tell them it was after Raul vanished. That's true in the broad sense. But if I'm being exact, the pattern started showing itself the week before, when he gave me a set of instructions without calling them instructions. We were repairing a break in the water line near the old Catholic section. It was late afternoon in August, monsoon season, and the clouds had built up black over the mountains without yet deciding whether to come down on us. The ground was tacky under the top crust, and every shovelful released that cold mineral smell. Raul had gone quiet, which usually meant he was tired. Then he said, without looking at me, If you ever hear somebody call your name from the south field after sunset, don't answer until you see teeth. I stopped shoveling. What? He kept working. Not a face, teeth. That doesn't clear it up much. It isn't supposed to. I waited for the grin that would tell me he was winding me up. It never came. He straightened slowly, pressed a hand into the small of his back, and finally looked at me. There are a few things out here you can survive by being careful. This is one of them, I said. You really believe that? He brushed dirt off the pipe coupling. I don't need belief. I've got experience. I should have pushed him then, asked what he'd seen. Who else knew? Whether he was sick, whether this was some county hazing ritual I'd missed. Instead, I asked the kind of question people ask when they already know they won't like the answer. How many things? Raoul glanced toward the office, making sure nobody from a late funeral was near enough to hear, then counted on his fingers. Don't answer voices in the south field after sunset. Don't open a reopened grave alone, no matter whose paperwork says to. If you see lights moving under the chapel floor, you leave the building and lock it behind you. And if a family tells you they already had the burial, but you know they didn't, you call me before you call anybody else. I remember saying, "That's not funny." He said, "No." I remember the sound just then more than the words. The sky was still dry, but somewhere far off, a roll of thunder came over the hills, and the metal sign at the gate gave one hard bang in the wind. Raoul looked older in that moment than I had ever seen him. He told me one more thing before we packed up. If I'm not here one day, don't go looking for me in the south field. 2 mornings later, I did exactly that. The last normal thing I ever saw Raoul do was initial a fuel receipt and complain that the county bought cheap trimmer line. He came in before me on a Thursday, opened the gate, signed the maintenance log at 5:12 a.m., and radioed dispatch at 5:26 to report a section of fence down by the wash after overnight rain. At 6:03, a woman visiting her husband's grave in the veterans' lawn told the office she had seen Raoul walking toward the south field, carrying a probe rod and a coil of orange line. At 7:10, he wasn't answering the radio. By 7:40, our office clerk, Elena Chavez, called me on my cell because I was out getting diesel from the county yard. She said it was probably nothing. Maybe his radio battery died. Maybe he'd gone home sick without telling anybody. Maybe he was helping a funeral home retrieve a marker and forgot to check in. Her voice had that strained, careful tone people use when they're already scared and trying not to spread it. I got back in 13 minutes. His county truck was parked crooked outside the shed with the driver's door open. The probe rod was gone. His radio charger was still plugged in. On the workbench sat his lunch cooler and an opened packet of salt crackers. The office smelled like copier toner and funeral flowers, and Elena was standing with both hands flat on the desk, like she needed to hold herself down. "Sheriff's been called," she said. "Maybe he fell." The south field spread away from the older sections in low, uneven rows with gravel lanes between them. Out there, the markers got smaller, cheaper, and farther apart. Some were government plaques. Some were numbered concrete posts. Some were nothing but stake depressions, where records said a burial existed and weather had erased the evidence. The rain from the night before had pooled in shallow pockets, leaving the dirt dark and firm enough to hold tracks. We had tracks. Raoul's work boots had a distinctive heel wear, the right side ground down more than the left. You could see that pattern leading away from the lane toward a cluster of numbered posts near the wash. Then, about 40 yards in, his tracks stopped. Not got lost, not crossed by other prints. Stopped. The last clear impression was his right heel, and the toe of his left boot pressed slightly deeper, like he had shifted his weight and turned. After that, nothing but smooth, damp dirt. Sheriff Mendez came with 2 deputies and a volunteer search team by mid-morning. They ran the usual explanations first. Maybe the rain had hardened different where we couldn't see it. Maybe he'd stepped on stone. Maybe he'd been picked up by someone. Maybe a medical event had made him wander into the brush. That would have been fine if the brush started there. It didn't. There were 20 clean yards in every direction. Open ground, low markers, thin grass. You could have watched a coyote cross it from the office window. They expanded the search. Dogs came in after lunch. One of them worked the track cleanly, nose down, straight to the last print, and sat. Its handler made it circle and resent twice. Same result, nose down, straight line, sit. I saw Sheriff Mendez's face change a little then. Not enough to admit anything, just enough that he stopped talking so much. Around 3, while deputies were sweeping the wash, I found the orange survey line. It was tied around marker S214 in a neat, bright loop, trailing across the dirt to S227, then S241, then S258. A line of stakes across the south field, as if Raul had been marking a boundary or measuring new burials. The problem was, those numbers weren't in order geographically. They jumped around old records, decades apart. And the line didn't make a straight path, it made a shape. I didn't understand that until I climbed onto the bed of the county truck and looked down. From that angle, the orange line formed a crude spiral, tightening inward, toward a bare patch of ground with no marker at all. I called Mendez over. He stared at it for a long second and asked Elena to bring the plat book. We checked the maps right there with the wind flipping pages. The bare patch was supposed to be empty. No burial listed, no reserved plot. Nothing under that ground according to county record, except old drainage fill. Mendez had a deputy probe it. The rod went in easy for the first foot, then hit something that gave with a soft, wet crunch that was not rock and not wood. The deputy pulled back fast and swore. Mendez told everybody to step away. A proper investigation would have meant paperwork, a coroner, permits, likely state involvement if human remains were disturbed without documentation. What actually happened was Mendez looked at me, then at the families visible in the newer section, then back at the ground, and made the practical decision public offices make when truth threatens to become expensive. He said we'd finish the search perimeter first. By dusk, Raul was still missing. I stayed late because Mendez asked me to secure the equipment and because, if I'm honest, I couldn't leave, knowing that empty patch was there, with his tracks ending near it. The search team cleared out around sunset. Elena went home shaking. The deputies made one last pass of the road and left a cruiser near the gate. The clouds had broken by then, and the cemetery took on that washed, clean look twilight can give to ugly places. The stones went gray-blue. The weeds cast longer shadows than they should have. Somewhere down by the wash, water dripped from the fence wire. I was locking the shed when I heard Raul call my name. Not shout. Just call it in the same tired tone he used when he wanted me to bring a wrench. Daniel. It came from the south field. I froze with the padlock in my hand. Every piece of common sense I had said the same thing at once. If it was really him, he needed help. If it wasn't, then whatever I thought I knew had just broken open. Daniel, the voice said again. The sound was wrong in one specific way I still remember. It was clear, but it had no distance to it. It didn't sound far or near. It sounded as if the air had decided to make his voice without using his body. I took 2 steps toward the lane, before Raul's warning came back to me so hard, it felt like memory with edges. Don't answer until you see teeth. I wish I could say I acted brave or wise. I didn't. I acted confused. I stood there with my mouth open, staring toward the south field while the first real fear I'd ever felt on that job moved through me slow and cold. Then I saw movement. Not a full figure. Something pale passing between the low-numbered posts. Too low to be a standing man, and too smooth to be somebody crawling over rough ground. It moved like fabric being pulled just above the dirt. Then it stopped behind one of the concrete markers. I waited. A face slowly leaned out from behind the marker. At that distance, all I could make out were the eyes. Too dark, too still, and a mouth open just enough to show teeth. It was not Raul. The skin looked stretched tight and gray in the failing light, and the teeth showed in a way living mouths don't. as if the lips had forgotten what they were for. I backed away without thinking. The thing leaned a little farther out. One hand came up and rested on the top of the concrete marker, long fingers muddy to the wrist. Then the deputy at the gate hit his siren once to get my attention, and when I looked back, the marker stood there by itself. I did not go into the south field that night. The official story was that Raul Varela likely suffered a medical event and became disoriented in the wash during storm conditions. That's what the county put in writing. They never found a body. They held a memorial mass with an empty photograph board and a folded county flag, because he'd spent 6 years on road emergency response. People brought casseroles to his sister's house. The county posted his position within 2 months. I took over most of his routes before they hired anybody else. That sounds like a man stepping into an empty role. It wasn't. It felt like being moved into a seat at a table where someone had left a warning under the plate. After Raul disappeared, I found his notebook in the false bottom of an old file drawer in the office. It wasn't dramatic. No occult symbols. No maps drawn in blood. Just dates, plot numbers, weather notes, names, and 4 instructions written on the inside cover in block letters, dark enough to score through the paper. Don't answer after sunset. Don't uncover what reopens itself. Don't stay in the chapel if the lights go under. Don't let them bury twice. I wish I had stopped reading there. The next story is why I didn't. The second thing that happened to me at San Isidro was the burial that arrived without a body. If you've never worked around funeral logistics, it sounds impossible on its face. It isn't. Bodies get delayed. Paperwork gets separated. A hearse breaks down between counties. Most of the time there's confusion before anybody leaves the funeral home, because the family, the priest, the director, and the cemetery all have to line up. But confusion has a shape. It has phone calls, apologies, somebody sweating and somebody else checking a folder 3 times. This had none of that. It was late October, cold enough in the morning that the metal rake handles bit your hands. We had one scheduled service at 10 for an elderly woman from Ocotate, whose family had owned the plot for years. I had the tent set, chairs out, artificial turf down over the dirt, everything in order. Around 9:30 a second procession came through the gate unannounced. 3 cars, an older hearse, and a white pickup behind them. No flags on the vehicles, no funeral home placards, no church escort. That by itself was enough to put me on guard. I waved them down before they reached the main lawn and asked who they were there for. The driver of the hearse was a thin man in a black suit that didn't fit him right. He had a face I should have remembered if I'd seen it before, but I didn't. Not because he was strange looking, because he looked like a blurred version of every undertaker I'd ever met. Proper haircut, pale hands, black tie, expression set 1 notch too low. He told me they were there for a graveside burial in the old Catholic section. Family name Romero. I checked my clipboard. No Romero burial, he said. There must be some mistake. We already had the chapel service. That was the first line in Raul's notebook that came back to me. Don't let them bury twice. I asked for paperwork. He smiled a little. Not insulted, not friendly. Just patient in a way that made me feel I was the one delaying something prearranged. The family is grieving, he said. Let us through, and we'll sort it after. I looked past him into the first car. 3 people sat inside dressed for a funeral. Black clothes, hands in laps, nobody crying. Nobody looking at me either. They were all facing forward. I went to the passenger side and tapped the window. The woman in front turned her head. I couldn't tell her age exactly. 40 maybe 70. Her veil obscured her face more than it should have, considering the light. I asked who they were burying. She said, my mother. Name? She paused just slightly. Romero. First name? Another pause. Then from the back seat, a child's voice said, we buried her already. The woman turned so fast, the veil snapped against the glass. I stepped back. The hearse driver opened his door, still wearing that careful calm. Sir, he said. "You're upsetting them. Now, if this had happened in town, in full daylight with traffic and people around, I think I would have taken harder control of it. But the cemetery does something to normal authority. The place quiets everything, even arguments. And there was something wrong with the quiet around those cars. No engine tick, no muffled radio, no children shifting, just stillness. I told them to pull into the side lane and wait while I called the office. The driver said, "We don't have much time." I said, "Then you should have called ahead." His expression changed at that, not anger. More like disappointment that I was forcing him to be explicit. "Mr. Ortega," he said, and I had not told him my name. "Please understand, they become difficult if the second part is delayed. I don't mind telling you that I felt my stomach drop then. I backed away to my truck, radioed Elena, and told her to call Sheriff Mendez. I kept my eyes on the vehicles the whole time. Elena asked what was happening. I said, "Either somebody is playing games at a funeral, or we've got a problem Raul knew about." She went quiet for a beat, then said she was calling. When I looked back, the white pickup had moved. Not driven, moved. It now sat angled toward the old Catholic section with its tailgate down. There had been no sound of a door, no crunch of gravel, nothing. On the bed of the truck was a plain pine coffin. I am certain that coffin had not been there 30 seconds earlier. I walked toward it because I still had enough training left in me to think in procedures. Unscheduled coffin on cemetery grounds, potential theft, prank, or illegal burial. Verify contents, secure scene. The people from the cars had gotten out by then. 5 altogether. The driver, the veiled woman, a teenage boy, an older man in a dark coat, and a little girl, maybe 8 years old, carrying a bunch of wilted white carnations. They stood in a loose half-circle near the truck, all of them watching me without speaking. "Step back," I said. None of them moved. I repeated it louder. The little girl looked at the older man and asked, in a voice so ordinary it still bothers me, "Does he work here now?" The older man said, "He does." The lid of the pine coffin had been nailed shut in 6 places. New nails, clean wood, no funeral home tag, no marker card. I asked them one last time whose remains were inside. The veiled woman said, "What's left?" Then the little girl added, "The part that kept standing." I used the claw end of a hammer from my truck to pry the first nail loose. My hand was slipping with sweat, even though the air was cold. I remember the smell before the lid came off fully, not decay. Damp earth, old flowers, and something metallic, like wet pennies rubbed between fingers. When I lifted the lid, the coffin was full of dirt, not filled to the top, arranged. There were layers to it, like somebody had scooped soil from different depths and packed it carefully. Light, dry topsoil over darker clay over a strip of white caliche, and laid across the center, half visible, was a forearm wrapped in burial cloth gone brown with age. Human, no question. The hand was still attached. Its fingers were curled around a rosary that had fused with mud. I slammed the lid shut and stumbled back. The group by the truck had not changed expression at all. They looked like people waiting for a mechanic to finish inspecting a tire. Sheriff Mendez radioed he was 10 minutes out. I told the group nobody was being buried, nobody was leaving, and law enforcement was on the way. The hearse driver gave me a long, tired look. "It isn't a law matter," he said. "What is it?" "A courtesy one." I said nothing. He nodded toward the old Catholic section. "That grave has opened twice this month. Something keeps rising through where it shouldn't. We return what belongs there. Then it rests." I asked which grave. The little girl pointed. It was plot C19, a family grave behind a short wrought iron fence, one of the old ones with hand-cut names and 3 burials already recorded. I knew the plot. A Romero child had been buried there in 1919, an adult daughter in 1947, the matriarch in 1962. Nobody since. The dirt over C19 looked slightly sunken, but plenty of old graves settle. Nothing dramatic. I said, "Who opened it?" The older man in the dark coat finally spoke. His voice sounded rough, like it hadn't been used enough. "Not who. What comes back when all the names are gone?" At that moment, the bells in the chapel rang once. We did not have working bells in the chapel. Every person in that group turned their head toward the sound at the same time. Then the little girl smiled. It wasn't a threatening smile. That would have made more sense. It was relieved, like she'd been waiting for confirmation. She said, "It knows we're here." Mendez came in fast enough to throw gravel from the lane. 2 deputies got out with hands near their belts until they saw the coffin and the people standing around it. Then you could see them trying to decide whether this was fraud, a mental health situation, or grief dressed up strange. Mendez separated me from the group and asked for the short version. I gave it to him. He stared at the pine box, then at the old Catholic section, then at the hearse. He asked the hearse driver for license and funeral authorization. The driver handed him a card from a funeral home in Raton. Mendez checked it. Called it in. No such funeral home. When he looked up again, the man in the black suit was gone. Not ran off. Gone. Both deputies swore they had been watching the group. Neither could say when he moved. Then the older man in the dark coat started walking toward plot C-19. Mendez shouted for him to stop. The man did not stop. One deputy caught up and grabbed his shoulder. His hand went through the coat. I know how that sounds. I know. But I was there. The deputy lurched forward off balance like he'd reached into hanging cloth and expected resistance. The coat folded around his arm, and the man kept walking. That broke whatever professional posture remained. Mendez drew his weapon. The veiled woman took the little girl's hand. The teenage boy looked straight at me and said, very quietly, "He should have let us do it the first time." The older man reached C-19 and stepped over the low edging stones. He knelt at the grave, placed both palms flat on the settled dirt, and bowed his head. The ground moved, not exploded, not split wide. It breathed. That's the only word that fits. The mound over the grave lifted a few inches, held, then eased down again, like something underneath had tested the weight of the earth above it. The little girl began humming. I don't know the tune, but it carried across the cold air sharp and small, and I saw all at once why Raoul said some things were about survival and not belief. Because once you see dirt rise over a closed grave in daylight, with witnesses standing beside you, explanation becomes a luxury. Your first duty is choosing what to do next. Mendez fired one shot into the ground at the edge of the plot. The sound snapped the moment open. The grave sank flat again. The humming stopped. Every member of that strange group turned toward the gunshot with the same empty surprise, like birds startled from seed. Then the cars were empty. I don't mean they ran for them. I mean one instant the veiled woman, the boy, and the little girl were standing in the lane, and the next, the lane held only gravel, the wilted carnations, and the white pickup with the tailgate down. We searched the vehicles. The hearse had no engine block, just a cavity under the hood thick with packed dirt and dead moths. The first car had cracked registration from 1988 in the glove box. The second had nothing but dust and a dried funeral ribbon in the trunk. The white pickup's plates belonged to a ranch truck junked 15 years earlier. And the pine coffin in the bed? When the deputies reopened it, the forearm was gone. Just dirt. Layered exactly as before, but no bones, no cloth, no rosary. Mendez told me not to repeat most of that. Officially, the county report describes an abandoned vehicle incident involving illegal remains transport and possible vandalism. The vehicles were towed to impound. By the next morning, all 4 had rusted so badly, the tow operator refused to swear under signature they were the same vehicles he'd hooked the previous afternoon. 2 were missing VN plates entirely. The hearse upholstery came apart when touched. Plot C-19 was excavated under permit a week later. They found 3 documented burials and a 4th set of partial remains under the oldest coffin, commingled and incomplete, wrapped in cloth too deteriorated to date properly. No skull, no feet, one forearm missing from the elbow down. The church requested reinterment without publicity. The county agreed. Father Lucero from town came out with holy water and a face like a man trying not to remember his childhood. Before they closed the grave again, he pulled me aside and asked whether anybody had said the family already buried her. When I told him yes, he shut his eyes a moment and said, "Then someone told them to do the second part." I asked him who. He said, "The same thing that convinces people unfinished work belongs underground." That was not an answer, but it was enough to keep me awake. After that day, I stopped assuming the cemetery's worst danger was in the south field. Some things did not come from there. Some things were trying to get back to it. The third story is the one I hate telling most, because it involved a boy whose family had done everything right. If I tell you a grave was found open, you can imagine vandalism. You can imagine weather, poor compaction, an animal burrow, even bad luck. If I tell you what we found under that grave was the wrong body, people start deciding whether they believe me. That part doesn't matter much to me anymore. What matters is that a mother recognized her son's shirt cuff before any of us were willing to. His name was Andres Montoya, 12 years old. Bicycle accident on State Road 518, spring of my 7th year at San Isidro. Closed casket by the family's request. Quiet service. School friends in pressed shirts. His older sister carrying herself so rigid I thought at first she was angry, but she was just holding her breath between 1 minute and the next. There was rain 3 nights later, the kind that starts soft after midnight and builds toward dawn until the roof vents rattle. I got called in because the wash had overflowed near the south fence, and county dispatch wanted eyes on the grounds before morning services. I found Andres's grave open at 5:40 a.m., not dug up with shovels. Open. The backfilled dirt had slumped inward in a clean oval. The casket lid showed through the mud with one corner cracked and pushed up from beneath. Rainwater ran down into the gap. My first thought was structural failure, bad fill, weight shift. Maybe the burial vault had cracked. My second thought was Raul's notebook. Don't uncover what reopens itself. I radioed the office, told them to contact Mendez and the funeral home, then did the exact thing I'd been told not to do. I went closer. I tell myself I had to confirm whether water was entering the casket. I tell myself I was trying to protect a family from seeing damage to a child's grave, if I could fix it before they arrived. That is true. It's also true that curiosity is stronger in men who work alone. The crack in the lid was narrow at first glance, but once I knelt, I could see the wood had splintered upward, not down. Something inside had pushed against it hard enough to break a corner, and then stopped. Rain had soaked the satin lining visible through the gap. A smell came out, not full decomposition, not yet, but sweet and wet in a way that turned the stomach fast. I called Andres's name before I understood how stupid that was. No answer. Then I heard something tapping from inside the casket. 3 quick taps. Pause. 2 taps. I fell back so fast I hit the marker with my shoulder. The tapping came again. You can tell yourself 1,000 sensible things in a moment like that. Rain dripping through wood. Expansion. Tools shifting underground from the burial vault. Your own pulse in your ears. The body of a 12-year-old boy does not tap on casket wood after burial. The mind knows that. The body doesn't care. The body only knows sound inside a box where there should be none. I backed off and waited for Mendez. He arrived with a deputy and a funeral director named Colm Keating, who had handled the burial. Keating was furious before he was frightened. He kept saying the vault had been inspected, the seal checked, the casket secured. Then he saw the lid pushed up from underneath and shut up long enough to swallow. The family had not been notified yet. Thank God for that much. Mendez asked whether we needed the coroner before opening anything. Keating said if water had entered, they had legal and sanitary reasons to verify the condition immediately. He sounded like a man clinging to professional language because his mind had already left the room. I told them about the tapping. Mendez stared at me and asked if I was sure. No, I said. But yes. He told the deputy to record everything. We pried the lid at the damaged corner, just enough to look in. There was a body inside. It was not Andres Montoya. The suit jacket was wrong first. Black instead of navy. Then the size. This body filled the casket too fully. Shoulders broad, neck thick. The face had collapsed in early decomposition, but still showed dark stubble along the jaw. Adult male. Not recently dead either. Several weeks at least. Maybe more. There was packed dirt under the fingernails and in the ears. The left cuff of the white shirt was turned back, exposing a silver cufflink engraved with an M. Keating made a sound low in his throat and stepped away. Mendez asked me if Andres had worn cufflinks. Kid was 12, I said. We closed the lid immediately and secured the area. The family was called before the body could be removed, because there was no way around it at that point. Andres's mother arrived first. Her husband and daughter came behind in separate vehicles, all three carrying that look families get when they know something is wrong, but haven't yet found the shape of it. Keating tried to explain in neutral terms. There had been a grave compromise, identification issue, investigation needed. The mother listened all the way through without interrupting. Then she walked past him to the open grave, ignored the tape, and looked down through the cracked lid. She did not scream. She said very quietly, "That is not my son." Then she pointed at the turned-back cuff. That shirt was my husband's. We buried Andres in that shirt because he wanted to match his father for First Communion pictures. Her husband had died 9 years earlier and was buried in Santa Fe. That's when the real damage began. Investigators were brought in. Vault serials were checked. Casket transport chain reviewed. Burial photographs compared. Everything on paper said Andres was placed in that grave 3 days earlier, and nobody else had access. The funeral home swore no switch occurred. The church confirmed the service. The cemetery log matched the plot assignment. On the practical side, the case made no sense. On the physical side, it was worse. The adult body inside the casket was identified by dental records 4 days later as Miguel Montoya, Andres's father. The same Miguel Montoya buried in Santa Fe 9 years earlier. You want the official explanation? Administrative error during historical remains transfer, compounded by storm damage and record confusion between related surnames across counties. That's what got floated, because the alternative required admitting that a sealed child's grave in Mora County had somehow produced the long-buried remains of his father from another cemetery. Santa Fe denied any disturbance to Miguel's grave. Their records showed it intact. The family insisted on opening it. It was empty, not robbed in the ordinary sense. No broken seals, no obvious dig marks. The soil over the burial had settled cleanly. The casket, when exhumed, contained only a folded navy suit jacket, a child's bicycle reflector, and damp earth. That should have made the news farther than it did. It didn't, because county offices protect themselves first and grieving families second. A state investigator came up, spent 2 days asking procedural questions with the expression of a man rearranging his worldview in private, and then most of the paper trail went quiet. But there were details the official reports did not include. While the Montoya case was being processed, I spent 2 evenings in the record room with Elena and Father Lucero, going through older burial registers. We found 3 previous incidents, decades apart, all involving family graves after heavy rain. In each one, a relative was discovered where another relative should have been, parent for child, wife for husband, older brother for younger. Each time there had been enough confusion, enough damaged paperwork, or enough pressure from family shame that the case never became public beyond the town. And every one of those incidents touched one of 2 areas, the old Catholic section, or the South Field. Father Lucero kept rubbing his thumb over the edge of the ledger as he read. Finally, he said, This was not unknown. Elena looked up. To who? He didn't answer immediately. Then he said, to the men who started keeping duplicate ground. I asked what that meant. He told us that before the county system was standardized, poor families and unclaimed dead were sometimes buried outside official consecrated rows until paperwork caught up or a priest could be called. In drought years and epidemic years, corners got cut. Some burials were temporary in theory and permanent in practice. Ground was blessed later, renamed later, recorded later. On paper, a person could be moved from nowhere to somewhere long after the body itself had been forgotten. Forgotten by who? Elena asked. By the people who did the forgetting, he said. We were still in the office when Andres' sister came back alone that night. She must have been 17, maybe 18. She had her mother's jawline and her father's straight posture. She laid a cassette recorder on the desk and said she found it in Andres' backpack. He recorded himself talking when he rode his bike, she said. He liked the sound of the tires. I didn't understand why she was giving it to us until she added, this was the day before he died. We had an old tape player in the lost and found cabinet from when families still brought CDs to graveside services. Elena found fresh batteries. The tape began with wind noise. Andres narrating to himself about a shortcut, a dog on County Road B, a mud puddle he almost wiped out in. All the ordinary running commentary of a boy too young to know what becomes evidence later. Then his voice changed. He said, there's somebody at the cemetery fence. Tire noise slowed. A few seconds of static and breathing. Then Andres said, that's my dad. Not questioning. Certain. His sister closed her eyes. On the tape, Andres laughed once in disbelief, the way anybody would. Then he called, Dad? What came back over the cheap microphone was too faint to make out in full, but 3 words were clear enough to raise the hair on my arms even now. Help me stand. There was a clatter, the bicycle hitting ground, Andres breathing harder, running maybe. Then a second voice, still faint, still adult, but closer, said, wrong place. Wrong box. The tape ended in wind and scraping. The accident that killed Andres had happened a mile away, at dawn, with no witnesses except the truck driver who found him, after he had already gone off the road. He had massive head trauma. The police had written it as a bicycle wreck in wet conditions. Maybe it was. Maybe he rode away scared and took a curve too fast in the dark, but his front tire had been found bent inward, as if struck from the side, not from a simple crash. That detail got lost in the file, because a dead child closes investigations faster than an unexplained one. The Montoyas moved Andres and Miguel both to Santa Fe after that, to a family plot watched over by living relatives. Before they left, Andres' mother came to the office and asked me a question I still can't answer honestly. She said, did something there use my boy because it knew who his father was? I told her I didn't know. The truth is I did know one part. Something in that cemetery understood family. It understood the pull between names, blood, memory, and unfinished grief. Not in a symbolic way, in a practical one, like roots understanding where water goes. After the Montoya case, I considered quitting. I had money saved by then, and my mother told me more than once she'd rather lose the county insurance than lose sleep, wondering what kind of place I worked in. But leaving a job is easier when fear points cleanly one direction. Mine didn't. I had begun to feel that if I walked away without understanding the pattern, it would follow me in the shape of every unanswered call, every name on every stone. Then the chapel lights went under. That was the 4th incident, and it is the one I believe the county actively buried. San Isidro's chapel was small, older than the office, and built over a low crawl space that was supposed to contain little more than pipe access and electrical conduit. We used it for brief services, bad weather gatherings, and storage of folding chairs when funeral traffic was light. It had plaster walls, 2 narrow stained glass windows, and a tile floor that never stayed level for long, because the ground under the east side kept settling by fractions. Raoul's notebook had one line about it I had never tested. Don't stay in the chapel if the lights go under. In my 9th year, I found out why. It began with a county order to prepare the lower storage room for archived records during a courthouse remodel. I told them there was no lower storage room. They sent plans proving there was a subfloor cavity accessible through a maintenance hatch behind the altar wall. None of us had used it in decades. Mendez came out because old public spaces get everybody nervous when you mention hidden access and records in the same sentence. Elena had the key ring. I had a crowbar because the hatch paint had sealed over. When I pried it loose, a smell came out that stopped all 3 of us where we stood. Not sewage, not mold. Cold, damp air mixed with candle wax, dead flowers, and something stale and sweet, like funeral makeup left in heat. The cavity was deeper than expected, more a low cellar than a crawl space, with stone footings and a narrow run of wooden steps descending into black. Mendez shined his flashlight down and said, "That wasn't on the plans." He was right. The plans showed 18 inches of clearance. This was closer to 6 feet at center, maybe more toward the far side where the ground sloped. We should have sealed it and called the county engineer. Instead, we did what small-town officials always do when a problem sits on their desk without a budget line. We looked ourselves. The beam of my light picked out stacked chairs, old hymnals swollen with damp, 2 broken candelabras, and shelves of boxed records along the west wall. Ordinary enough. Then deeper in, beyond the first row of shelves, I saw a line of little white bulbs. At first, I thought somebody had run extension lights. Then I realized I wasn't seeing bulbs. I was seeing the chapel floor lights shining through cracks between the tiles above us, except the cracks were too wide and too evenly spaced, forming a rough rectangle in the earth, as if the floor plan upstairs did not match the ground below. Elena whispered, "Why is there another room under the aisle? There shouldn't have been any room at all." We went down together because nobody wanted to be the one left alone above. The dirt floor was cold enough to come through my boots. Water dripped somewhere in steady intervals. The shelves held parish boxes dating back to the 1940s, some eaten through by mice, some tied in twine. On the far wall, someone had lime-washed over older writing, but not well enough. You could still see names underneath. Not all full names, some initials, some plot numbers, some simply female, infant, male unknown, brought at night. Mendez was reading one when the overhead chapel lights clicked off. Pitch dark. Elena made a sound like a swallowed cry. I hit my flashlight so hard I nearly dropped it. Mendez got his beam on a second later. That's when we saw lights moving under the floor. Again, there are no words for this that don't sound foolish. Thin bands of yellow light began sliding through the cracks in the earth overhead, not from fixtures above us, but from below the packed soil and old stone beneath the chapel's visible floor. They moved in slow crossing lines, as if lanterns were being carried under us through a second buried corridor. Elena said, "No." Mendez said, "Out, right now." We turned for the stairs. Something knocked from the other side of the wall. 3 heavy knocks. Wood on wood. Then a voice, muffled and low, said, "Open for the family." Elena grabbed my arm hard enough to hurt. There was no door in that wall. The knocking came again, closer this time, and dust shook loose from the lime wash. I saw one of the old parish boxes tremble on the shelf edge. Mendez shouted, "Move!" We got halfway up the stairs when the chapel above us began making a different kind of sound. Chair legs scraping tile, dozens of them, though the chapel had been empty when we entered, and the folding chairs were stacked behind us in the cavity. Then came voices overhead. Not loud, funeral voices, murmuring, soft coughs, fabric shifting. The sound of people settling into pews before a service. The impossible calm of it was worse than screaming would have been. At the top of the steps, Elena stumbled. I turned to help her and looked back down. exactly long enough to regret it. At the far end of the cavity, where there had been only damp wall a moment earlier, a doorway stood open into complete darkness. Not a hole in stone, a framed doorway with trim blackened by age. Beyond it, I could hear a priest beginning a prayer in Spanish. Mendez got Elena through the hatch first. I came after. He slammed the hatch and shoved a brass altar stand over it just as the chapel lights overhead came back on. The room looked normal. No crowd, no chairs out, no priest, just sunlight through stained glass and dust floating where our breathing disturbed it. Then one of the sidewall sconces flickered. Instead of going dark, the light seemed to descend inside the wall. That's the only description I have. The glow dropped from the sconce level to knee level, then to floor level, then below, as if the bulb itself were sinking through plaster into the ground. Mendez saw it too. His face had gone the color of paper. "Elena," he said, "go to the cruiser." She did not argue. We closed the chapel for structural inspection that afternoon. County engineer, parish council, and a representative from Santa Fe all came through over the next week. Publicly, they said moisture damage, undocumented historical modifications, and unsafe subfloor voids. Privately, I heard Mendez tell one of the county commissioners that if anybody reopened that hatch without clergy and state oversight, he would arrest them for trespassing on his crime scene, whether there was technically a crime or not. That should have ended it. Instead, it exposed why the county had reason to keep quiet. Among the boxes below the chapel, Elena had grabbed one at random in her panic and carried it out without realizing. We opened it in the office later. Inside were burial cards from the 1950s and 60s, but not the ones that matched the official ledger. These were side records, duplicate ground assignments, night burials, temporary placements awaiting family payment or church approval, handwritten notes about moved remains that never appeared in the county plat, and attached to one card by rusted paperclip was a memo from a former county clerk dated 1964. It read, "Continue south receiving field until lower chamber resolves overcrowding. Do not mark transitional placements until father indicates which names may be transferred upward." May be transferred upward. I read that sentence 10 times. It meant the cemetery had maintained, unofficially, a buried holding system under or near the chapel for bodies not yet assigned permanent recognized ground. It meant names could be delayed, shifted, erased, or elevated depending on payment, status, clergy discretion, or pressure from families. It meant some dead had spent time in between, beneath consecrated ceremony and beneath record. Mendez took the box. Not all of it. Enough. He told me the county would handle archival irregularities and that I was to keep the chapel closed except for approved repairs. He said it in the tone of a man who wanted cooperation more than trust. I asked him whether Raul knew. He looked at me for a long second. Raul knew enough to stay out from underneath. "Did you?" he said. "I do now." A month later, the chapel hatch was filled with poured concrete. The county records office claimed no alternate burial ledger had ever existed. Elena transferred to tax assessment. And 2 weeks after the concrete pour, a family arrived insisting their grandmother had already had her chapel service the night before, with candles, a full rosary, and Father Lucero presiding. The grandmother was alive in Albuquerque. That was when I stopped thinking of the cemetery as haunted in the ordinary sense. It was not one dead thing lingering. It was a system that had learned how to keep operating. The last story is why I finally left. By then, I had spent nearly a decade telling myself I could manage the place by rules. Daylight, only in the south field unless required. Never investigate a reopened grave alone. No chapel after dusk, locked no matter what. Verify every family, every hearse, every paper trail twice. I had even started doing what Raul did, listening before entering certain areas, as if sound itself could tell me whether the ground was in one of its moods. For a while, that worked. Then the cemetery learned my routine too. My mother died in February of my 11th year, quietly, in the hospital, with my sister holding one hand and me holding the other. A natural death, if there is such a thing, when lungs fail by inches over years. I took my bereavement days, arranged what needed arranging, buried her in Santa Fe beside her parents, because she had asked for that, and came back to work, because grief does not stop bills, and more than that, because empty hours are worse than occupied ones after a death. People were kind for about 2 weeks. Then they went back to bringing me plot questions and irrigation complaints. That was fine. I preferred it. What wasn't fine started on the first morning I returned, when I found a bouquet of hospital carnations tied with oxygen tubing to the gate of the south field. White flowers, plastic tubing, no card. I threw it away and told myself somebody thought they were being sympathetic in a stupid way. The next day, the same bouquet was on my truck seat, doors still locked. I burned it in the equipment burn barrel after lunch. 3 days later, my office phone rang at 6:12 a.m., before any family should have been in. When I answered, I heard my mother breathing, not speaking, breathing through an oxygen cannula with that dry hitch she'd had near the end, followed by the tiny click of condensation in the line. I stood there frozen so long the breathing stopped. Then her voice said, very gently, "Danny, can you come help me up?" I hung up hard enough to crack the receiver. That was the first time the cemetery used her voice. The second was worse because it happened with witnesses. We had a county crew replacing fence posts near the wash. 2 road workers named Joel and Nick, both solid men, not fanciful, not local gossip types. Around 10:30, Joel came to the office pale and sweating and asked whether there was an older woman walking the south field in a blue cardigan. There was not, he said. She had been standing beyond the numbered posts waving one arm like she needed assistance. He thought maybe a relative had gotten confused and wandered too far in the mud, so he started toward her. Nick grabbed him and told him the woman wasn't moving right. I asked what he meant. Nick said, "Everything moved except the feet." They both saw her raise a hand again. Then they heard her call, "Daniel," not Joel, not Nick, me. I sent them home on the excuse of a water main emergency and finished the posts myself, with one eye on the south field the whole time. That evening I went through Raoul's notebook again from the start. Most of it was dates and scraps, but in the back pages he had written something I'd missed before because it was tucked between fuel logs. It uses the voice that lowers you. I sat with that line for a long time. Not the voice you trust, not the voice you love, the voice that lowers you, the one that makes you bend, reach, kneel, open, answer, climb down, the voice that gets your weight moving in the wrong direction. After dark, I drove to Father Lucero's rectory and showed him the notebook. He read it twice, then got a box from his closet containing photocopies of burial registers I had never seen. He told me there had been rumors for generations about the receiving ground, a place for the dead not yet fully admitted, held between naming and placement. In folk terms, people said it was hungry. In church terms, he said, the problem was profanation compounded by repetition. The dead had been treated like inventory too many times, and whatever order ought to govern burial had been bent into a habit of temporary use. "Can that create this?" I asked. He gave me the only honest answer available. I don't know what language can create when enough people practice the same disrespect for long enough. Then he tapped the inside cover of Raoul's notebook. "But your friend learned what not to feed." "What feeds it?" "Recognition," he said. "Response. The act of giving it the person it asks for." That sounds abstract until it isn't. 2 nights later, during a hard March wind, the alarm at the cemetery office tripped at 1:08 a.m. I was on call that week. Mendez met me there because after the chapel incident, he insisted on responding to after-hours alarms when he could. The gate was closed. No visible break-in. Office secure. Shed secure. But the south field gate, An old chain section used for equipment access stood open 6 inches against the wind. Neither of us had touched it. Mendez told me to stay by the truck while he called in the perimeter. Then we both heard it, metal tapping from out in the dark, slow, hollow, like a shovel handle striking a marker. Tap, pause, tap, tap. My flashlight beam went over the numbered posts and caught nothing but blowing dust. The wind had that high, empty sound it gets crossing open ground, and under it I could hear another noise, softer and wetter, like fabric dragging across soil. Then my mother's voice came from the dark. "Danny." I fell. I shut my eyes for half a second, because my body wanted to move before my mind could stop it. Mendez heard it too. "Jesus," he said softly. The voice came again, farther in. "Danny, please." Mendez raised his flashlight and called, "Who's there?" No answer to him, only to me. "Danny." I remembered the first warning. Don't answer after sunset until you see teeth. But I also remembered the others. Don't uncover what reopens itself. Don't stay if the lights go under. Don't let them bury twice. Rules aren't superstitions if you know what they protect against. They're a map of previous costs, I told Mendez. Whatever it is, it wants one person. He said, "Then we leave." That would have been the smart move. Instead, the ground gave a low, wet crack from somewhere near the center of the south field. Our lights found fresh subsidence opening along a row of numbered markers. Not a sinkhole exactly, more like several graves settling at once in a line, dirt dropping inward as if something below had shifted from side to side. One of the concrete posts toppled over. Another leaned and vanished into dark. Mendez swore into his radio and started toward it before I could stop him. Professional reflex. Hazard first, mystery later. Then a second voice came from the open gate behind us. "Raul, Sheriff, leave him." Mendez turned so fast I thought he'd fire. A figure stood just outside the spread of our headlights. Male shape, county jacket, head slightly bent in the old way Raul held it when listening. Mendez said, "Who's there?" The figure lifted its face. Even at that distance I could see the teeth first, too visible, too still. "Leave him," it said again in Raul's voice. Mendez backed toward me. "Truck," he said. But the south field gate slammed wider instead of shut, and from beyond it came more voices than I could separate. Some pleading, some calling names, some simply making the low, crowded murmur of people waiting for service to begin. The sound spread across the dark in layers. Old men coughing, a child whining, women speaking under their breath, the rustle of Sunday clothes. Then our headlights swept the field as the wind rocked the truck, and I saw them. Not bodies standing up out of graves. That would have been simpler. They were shapes, where the ground had sunk, faces just below the surface, pushing upward through wet soil, as if a thin skin of earth held them down. Mouths opening, eyes closed or half open, foreheads pressing against dirt from beneath. Some with burial cloth, some bare, some only partial, features emerging and sliding back as the soil shifted. Every time one of them moved, another voice joined the dark. Mendez made the sign of the cross. I had never seen him do that before. Then I saw one face I recognized, my mother. Not because it looked exactly like her. It didn't. The soil distorted everything. But the line of the cheek, the set of the brow, and the blue hospital cardigan half visible at one shoulder were enough to hit me below thought. She opened her mouth. I did not wait for the voice. I grabbed the length of chain hanging from the equipment gate and wrapped it around the open section twice, dragging with all the force I had. Mendez caught on instantly and helped me. The gate fought us harder than wind should allow, tugging inward as if pulled from the field side. The chain cut my palm. Metal screamed against metal. Behind us the voices rose, not angry, not monstrous, urgent, persuasive, like a room full of people trying to convince one man to do the decent thing. "Please, just help, lift me." Open. Wrong box. Second part. I got the chain through the latch, and Mendez snapped the padlock shut. The effect was immediate, not silence. Worse. All the voices stopped except one. My mother's. Very clear now, only inches beyond the gate. "Danny," she said, "I know you hear me." I kept my eyes on the lock. The chain began vibrating in my hands. Not wildly. A fine, steady tremor like current through wire. Then something struck the other side of the gate once. Hard enough to ring the whole frame. Another hit followed. Then another. Moving not across the metal but up it, as if hands were climbing. Mendez dragged me backward by the shoulder. We got into the truck and reversed too fast for the lane, gravel spitting under the tires. In the headlights as we turned, I saw the figure in the county jacket standing beside the south field gate, one hand resting on the chain we had just locked. Raul's face watched me go. The teeth showed white, even in dust. County crews came out at dawn with barriers and filled dirt. Mendez closed the south field for erosion hazard. By noon there were engineers, a diocesan representative, and a state office vehicle at the cemetery. They all stood where the gate had been, because the gate was gone, not broken, not torn loose. Gone. The posts remained. The chain and padlock remained twisted in the dirt between them, but the gate section itself had vanished. So had 6 numbered markers and 12 feet of fence line beyond, as if that stretch had never been attached. The ground where I had seen faces was flattened by morning, freshly settled. No visible collapse, no exposed remains, no prints except ours. Mendez walked the area with me once in daylight. We found only one thing that did not belong. A hospital identification bracelet half buried near the missing fence line. My mother's full name was on it. Same date of birth. Same hospital. The plastic was clean. I left San Isidro 3 weeks later. Officially, I resigned for family reasons and mental strain following bereavement. Unofficially, Mendez told me, in a tone that was as close to apology as I ever heard from him, that the county was preparing to absorb the South Field into a restricted historic parcel, and that it would be better for everybody if men with notebooks stopped working there. I asked what that meant. He said, "It means records can be sealed easier than ground." Before I turned in my keys, I went once more to the office and checked the old file drawer where I had found Raul's notebook. There was one new page inside, folded in half. I know how that sounds. I know I could have put it there myself and forgotten. Except the paper was old county stock we hadn't used in years, and the handwriting was not mine. It matched Raul's block letters. One line only. It learns the shape of who comes back. I have spent a long time thinking about that sentence. At first, I thought it meant the cemetery studies the grieving, that it learns voices, habits, family ties, the forms people will trust enough to answer. I still think that's true, but over the years I've come to think there's a second meaning. Places like that do not simply hold the dead, they hold patterns of return. Name, view body, procession, prayer, lowering, dirt, flowers, visit again, speak again, remember again. Every burial teaches the ground the same sequence with different faces. If enough of those sequences are corrupted, if bodies are misplaced, delayed, stacked, hidden, renamed, transferred upward or downward like clerical problems, then maybe what remains is not a ghost in the storybook sense. Maybe it is a practice, a system of unfinished receiving, a mechanism that keeps trying to complete itself using whoever is nearest to the opening. I don't work cemeteries anymore. I repair irrigation for a school district south of Santa Fe. My days are valves, pumps, copper lines, broken timers, ordinary failures. I like ordinary failures. They stay where you fix them. Sometimes people recognize my name from Mora County and ask whether it's true I left because the old cemetery gave me the creeps. I usually tell them the job got too heavy after my mother died, which is true enough for conversation. What I do not tell them is that every March, around the week the wind turns cold again, I get one phone call with no caller ID. When I answer, I hear breathing first, then dirt shifting, then a room full of soft voices waiting for me to do the decent thing and come back to finish what was interrupted. I never stay on the line long enough to hear which voice it uses next, because after all these years, there is one possibility I still can't make peace with. If Raul was right, if that place learns the shape of whoever comes back, then maybe the worst thing buried at San Isidro is not what they put in the ground. Maybe it is the expectation that someone will always return for their own. And maybe that's why the dead there never sound hungry, they sound patient.